Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight, only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. Last time we watched the greatest fleet on earth sail home to China and the ocean fall silent behind it. Tonight we cross to the other end of the world, to a small poor kingdom on the westernmost edge of Europe, staring out at an ocean everyone said had no other side, and at a desert coast everyone said no ship could pass. There was a cape on that coast, a low line of red sand and fog and breaking water, and for a generation it stood at the absolute end of the known world. Sailors called the sea beyond it the Sea of Darkness. They said the water there boiled. They said the sun stood so close overhead that it burned ships black and men blacker, that the current ran only one way, so that whoever passed the cape would never come home. 15 times one prince sent his captains to pass it. 15 times they turned back. This is the story of the 16th attempt, and of the quiet, stubborn, complicated prince who spent his life sending other men over the edge of the map. His name was Henry. History calls him the Navigator. Portugal, at the start of the 1400s, was about the last place anyone would have picked to open the oceans of the world. It was small and it was poor. A strip of hill country and fishing harbours pressed between Castile and the Atlantic, with perhaps 1 million people at the far end of everything. The silks and spices of the East reached it last and cost it most, trickling across Asia through a dozen middlemen to Venice and Genoa, and arriving in Lisbon, marked up beyond the reach of kings. Portugal had one great asset. The sea was its front door. Its fishermen and coastal traders were bred to the Atlantic swell in a way that the sailors of the calm Mediterranean never quite were. And it had an unusually capable royal family. King John I had won the kingdom's independence in battle and married an English princess, Philippa of Lancaster, a serious, pious, formidable woman who raised her sons to be something new. Knights with account books, crusaders who could read a chart. Europe would come to call them the illustrious generation. The third of those sons, born in 1394, was the Infante Dom Enrique, Prince Henry. In 1415, when Henry was 21, Portugal did something audacious. In secret, the king assembled a fleet and an army and hurled them across the strait at Ceuta, the great Muslim fortress port on the Moroccan shore, the northern gate of Africa. The city fell in a single day. Henry fought in the assault, was knighted amid the smoke, and walked wide-eyed through what his generation regarded as a triumph of the faith, and what the people of Ceuta had every right to remember very differently. What Henry saw in the captured city changed the direction of his life. Ceuta was rich, richer than anywhere in Portugal. Its warehouses held silk and pepper, brass and carpets, and gold, fine African gold, carried north in dust and bars on camel caravans across the Sahara from somewhere far to the south, from lands beyond the desert that no European had ever seen. The merchants spoke of rivers down there, of a country of gold on the far side of the sands. There was a second, quieter lesson in Ceuta too. Holding the city proved almost worthless. The caravans simply moved their terminus elsewhere, and the gold flowed around the Portuguese garrison like water around a stone. Conquest plainly could not capture a trade, but a trade might be met at its source. If the gold was born somewhere south of the desert, then the kingdom that reached that somewhere first by sea in its own ships, past every middleman on earth, would never be poor again. A man could not follow the caravans. The desert and its masters would swallow him. But Henry, sailing home past the long African shore, could see the other road plainly enough. The desert had a coastline, and a coastline can be sailed. Henry never became a great mariner himself. In his whole life, he never sailed further than Morocco, a fact history has gently forgiven in a man it calls the Navigator. His gift was of a different kind. He was an organiser, a financier, a collector of men and knowledge, with a monk's austerity, a courtier's patience, and an obsession that lasted 40 years. He gathered to himself the means to feed it. As governor of the Algarve, Portugal's southern coast, and administrator of the wealthy Order of Christ, the old crusading order whose red cross his ships would carry on their sails, Henry had revenues, harbours, and a cause. At Sagres, on the bare headland at Europe's southwestern corner, where the land runs out into the Atlantic in a fist of rock, he kept a base and a household. Later, legend built it into a grand school of navigation, with observatories and lecture halls. The truth was Homlia, a working court of pilots, chart makers, shipwrights, and returned captains, Jewish astronomers and Italian traders among them, comparing notes year after year, each voyage's hard-won knowledge inked onto the next voyage's charts. The work was slow, and the work was cumulative. That was its genius. Every captain who returned to the Algarve was questioned, and his soundings, his bearings, his sketches of headlands went into the growing body of charts. The rutters, the written sailing directions, thickened year by year like the rings of a tree. The prince paid for voyages that returned nothing but knowledge, and lost money for decades with a stubbornness that looked to his contemporaries very like folly. And along the way, his enterprise picked up the ocean's first stepping stones almost casually. Madeira, sighted after a storm and settled in the 1420s, its slopes soon striped with vineyards and sugarcane. The Azores, found far out in the empty west, stocked with sheep before settlers. One day, these islands would be the inns and way stations of every Atlantic voyage to come. The Navigator was building more than a route down a coast. He was building the habit of ocean. And there was, in the middle of Henry's life, a wound that history often skips, and this story will not: Tangier. In 1437, the prince, Crusader first, always, led an assault on that Moroccan city and led it badly. The expedition was surrounded, and to buy its escape gave hostages, chief among them Henry's own youngest brother, Fernando, against a promise to return Ceuta itself. The promise was never kept. Crown and council judged Ceuta too valuable, the treaty void, the cost bearable. Fernando died in captivity at Fez 6 years later, and Portugal named him the Holy Prince and told itself stories about his patience. Henry withdrew to the Algarve and his ships and rarely again left them. It is not for us to read a man's heart across 5 centuries. But it is a fact that the voyages in the years after Tangier took on the character of the only crusade Henry had left. His motives were the tangled motives of his century, and it is honest to name them all. Gold, first, the river of it beyond the desert. The crusade always. Henry dreamed of outflanking the Muslim world entirely, and finding, somewhere beyond it, the legendary Christian king called Prester John, who might join Christendom's war from the far side. Souls, as his chronicler would insist, knowledge truly, the pure itch to know what lay beyond the next cape, and profit in human beings, as we shall see. For this story carries that weight too, and will not put it down. Year after year, his little ships went south, past Madeira, which his captains settled, past the Canaries, down the dry Moroccan shore where the land slowly turns to sand. And year after year, they stopped at the same place. Cape Bojador, the bulging cape, a low, fog-wrapped headland on the edge of the Sahara, where red dust blows out over shoal water, where the swell breaks far from shore, and where the medieval imagination had drawn its final line. Beyond Bojador, said the law of generations, the green sea of darkness, boiling water, a sun that burned men black, currents from which no sail returned. It is worth tasting the cosmology that made the Cape so final. The learned geography of the day, inherited from the ancients and elaborated by centuries of commentary, divided the earth into zones. And the tropics, in the strictest reading, were the torrid zone, where the sun's proximity made life impossible, and the sea itself might thicken and burn. Arab geographers, who knew better from the landward side, still called the Atlantic the Sea of Perpetual Gloom, where gin dwelt and no sail returned. Mapmakers filled the blank south with serpents and dog-headed men, not as decoration, but as honest labels for the unknown. Every sailor at Bojador carried that whole library in his head. What Gil Eanes disproved with a cask of flowers was not a current or a reef. It was 2,000 years of authority. The real dangers were more ordinary and quite bad enough. Fog, shallows, a coast with no landmarks and no water, and a wind that blew forever from the northeast, fair for going out and dead against coming home. But fear needs no accuracy to hold a line. 15 expeditions, by the count of Henry's own chronicler, reached that cape and turned around. The man who finally broke the spell was nobody's idea of a legend, which is perhaps the point of him. Gil Eanes was the squire of Henry's own household, from the town of Lagos, a household man, sent south in 1433, with the same orders as everyone before him, and like everyone before him, he found reasons to stop short. He went raiding in the Canaries instead, and came home with the Cape unpassed. The prince, the chronicle says, received him without anger, and sent him straight back, with words to this effect: the dangers ahead of you are not so great as the ones already behind you, and the reward of passing will be honour for as long as men remember. Go again, go past it. And in 1434, Gil Eanes went again. He did the simple, terrifying thing the problem required. Instead of hugging the deadly shore, he stood boldly out to sea, west and away from the land, sailed his little square-rigged barker out of sight of Africa altogether, and then came about and ran back east. When he raised the coast again, the dreaded Cape lay behind him. The sea had not boiled, the sun had not burned him. The water beyond the end of the world was water. He went ashore on that far side and found no gold and no monsters, only a low desert coast, silent in the haze. But something was growing there in the sand, a scatter of hardy little plants, which the sailors called the roses of St. Mary. Gil Eanes dug some up, tamped them into a cask of their own soil, and carried them home to his prince. Proof, green and alive, that the world beyond fear was only more world. The next year, Eanes went south again with a royal cupbearer named Baldia, and passed 50 leagues beyond the Cape. They saw the tracks of men and camels in the sand. The desert, it seemed, had people after all. Baldia pushed on further still into a long inlet they hopefully named the river of gold, the Rio de Oro. It was neither river nor golden, but the name, like so many names of this age, recorded the wish rather than the fact. They hunted sea wolves, monk seals, on its beaches, and came home with a cargo of skins. The first prophet, humble as it was, ever carried back from beyond the edge of the world. After Bojador, the coast opened like a door. After Bojador, the coast opened like a door. But the voyages home, against that eternal wind, taught Henry's sailors two lessons that would echo for centuries. The first was a ship. The heavy square-rigged barcus wallowed when they tried to claw back north. So the shipwrights of the Algarve refined something nimbler. The caravel, small, shallow of draught, and rigged with great triangular lateen sails on raked masts, a design borrowed from the Arab seamen of the old inland seas. A caravel could sail startlingly close against the wind, work a river mouth, and still cross an ocean. For 2 generations, it would be the exploring machine of the world, and Columbus and da Gama alike would owe it their lives. The second lesson was stranger and greater. The way home was through the open sea. To beat back to Portugal, pilots learned to leave the African coast entirely and swing far out into the Atlantic, west and north in a vast arc, until they picked up the westerly winds of higher latitudes that carried them home. They called it the volta do mar, the turn of the sea. It felt like madness. To get home, first sail away from home. But it was the master key to the age. The ocean was not a wall with a coastline to creep along. It was a system of winds, turning like a great wheel. And whoever learned the wheel could ride it anywhere. Now this story must carry its weight, as promised, told plainly and with the dignity the subject demands. In 1441, 2 of Henry's young captains, Antão Gonçalves and Nuno Tristão, sailing separately beyond the Cape, met on the desert coast and made themselves a darker kind of thirst. Wanting captives to question about the land and wanting, frankly, something of value to bring home, they raided a camp by night and seized a dozen human beings and carried them back to Portugal. The prince sent word of it to Rome as if it were a victory of the faith, and in the years that followed, the papacy issued solemn documents granting Portugal the right to subdue and enslave the peoples of the newfound coasts. The trade grew with terrible speed. In 1444, a company from Lagos sent out 6 caravels under a captain named Lanzarote, which fell upon the islands and shores south of the Cape and returned with 235 men, women and children. On the 8th of August 1444, in a meadow outside Lagos, they were driven ashore and divided into lots for sale. Families deliberately parted, the chronicle says, so the shares would come out even. We know the scene because Henry's own chronicler, Gil Eanes de Zurara, stood witness and wrote it down, and could not keep his composure. What heart so hard, he wrote, as not to be pierced by pity at the sight of that company, mothers clutching children, brothers separated, faces raised to the sky, the cries in a language the buyers did not need to understand. He wept as he wrote, he tells us, and then, being a man of his age and his master's servant, he reached for comfort and told himself their souls at least would now be saved. The prince sat on horseback at the edge of the field that day and took his 5th of the captives as lord. Within a few years, the crown regularised what the raiders had begun. On the island of Arguin, off the Mauritanian coast, the Portuguese built a fortified trading post. the first European factory on the Atlantic coast of Africa, and the seizing of captives by ambush gave way, for the most part, to the steadier and no less terrible business of purchase through African and Arab brokers who had their own old networks of bondage to draw upon. The chronicler could tell himself the trade had grown more orderly. For the people in the ships, the distinction meant nothing at all. It would be false to this story to look away from that meadow, and false too to pretend the men in it saw with our eyes. What began there in the accounting books of Lagos would grow over 4 centuries into the Atlantic slave trade, one of the greatest crimes in human history, and Europe's ocean age is not separable from it. The sea road south was opened by courage and paid for from very near the beginning in other people's chains. Both of those things are true at once. We will let them both stand. Past the desert, the world changed and disproved another library of fears. In 1444 and 1445, Henry's captains reached the mouth of the Senegal and rounded Cape Verde, the Green Cape, where the sand gave way, almost between one headland and the next, to grass and baobabs and villages under palm trees. The old doctrine that the tropics must be a burnt, uninhabitable waste dissolved on sight. Here was a peopled, watered, green country, with fishermen on the rivers and markets in the towns. The learned books had simply been wrong. A lesson the age would have to keep learning, cape after cape. The sky itself changed as the ships worked south, and the pilots had to learn a new one. Off these coasts, the pole star, the fixed nail on which all northern navigation hung, sank lower at every latitude, down toward the sea's rim. The old rule of thumb, its height above the horizon, grew useless in the very waters where men needed it most. The answer, worked out through years of patient observation the prince's household sponsored and collected, was to steer instead by the sun's height at noon, corrected from tables of its daily travel. Solar navigation, the beginning of scientific position finding at sea. It sounds dry, said quickly, but consider what it means that Portugal solved it. A kingdom of perhaps 1 million people systematically replacing the sky. The finest eyes on that coast belonged to a young Venetian in Henry's service, Alvise Cadamosto, who sailed south in 1455 and 1456 and wrote about it with a merchant's precision and a traveller's delight. He described trading up the Gambia River, the salt roads and the silent barter of the interior. A hippopotamus, which he had no name for, the astonishment of a coast that had never seen ships, where people rubbed the white from his skin to see if it was paint. He recorded too, looking up from those latitudes, that the North Star hung low near the horizon, while new stars rose in the south. The first European description of the constellation we call the Southern Cross. Even the sky, it turned out, was part of the map. And it changed as you went. The islands, meanwhile, were quietly becoming laboratories of the whole colonial future, for better and worse in equal measure. Madeira's timber and wheat gave way within a generation to a new crop. Sugar, and sugar remade everything it touched. Terraced slopes, water channels, cut through cliff faces, mills, fortunes, and a hunger for labour that the Guinea ships were already ominously learning to feed. By century's end, little Madeira was the largest sugar producer in the Western world, and the island model, cane, capital and coerced labour, stood ready to be exported across the Atlantic, where it would shape the history of 3 continents. The age of exploration carried more than sails and crosses in its hold. It carried economic blueprints, and some of them were terrible. Cadamosto's second voyage ended at the Gambia with the quiet discovery of a different kind. Blown offshore by a storm among unfamiliar islands, he had stumbled on the Cape Verde archipelago, green and utterly empty, where no human being had ever lived. Islands with no history at all, waiting to be given one. And the captains who followed him traced the coast onward to a mountainous shore where thunder rolled continuously among the peaks. They called it Serra Leoa, the Lion Mountains, for the sound, men said, was like the roaring of lions. It bears the name still, Sierra Leone. Prince Henry died in November of 1460 at Sagres on his bare headland above the Atlantic, 66 years old. He had never seen the lands his obsession uncovered. His captains had traced some 2,000 miles of African coast from Morocco to modern Sierra Leone and colonised the islands of Madeira, the Azores and Cape Verde. He died, the chronicles note, still owing money. Exploration never once turned him a profit. An austere, driven, contradictory man, half monk, half venture capitalist, patron of both discovery and the slave ships, who spent 40 years sending other men beyond the horizon he never crossed himself. They buried him first at Lagos, near the meadow where the captives had been sold, and later moved him to the great abbey at Batalha, among his brothers of the illustrious generation. On his tomb he lies in armour, hands folded, facing the ceiling of a church 100 miles from the sea he changed. The awkward truth of him has kept historians arguing ever since. Visionary or crusader, scientist or slaver, saint of the map or shareholder in its cruelties. Perhaps the honest answer is the one his own century would have found least remarkable. He was all of it at once, without ever feeling the contradiction. The horizon, however, no longer needed him. For a while after Henry's death, the Crown treated the enterprise as a business and little more, even leasing the whole African trade to a Lisbon merchant, Fernão Gomes, on remarkable terms. He could keep the profits, provided his captains discovered 100 new leagues of coastline every year. Discovery by contract and by the mile. It worked disturbingly well. In 5 years, Gomes's captains ran the map along the Gold Coast of modern Ghana, where the gold of the caravans finally met the sea, past the Great Bight of Africa and across the equator itself, where the last of the northern stars went under and pilots learned to steer by an unfamiliar sky. Then a new king took the work back into royal hands and everything accelerated. João II, a hard, brilliant, watchful man. Isabella of Castile called him simply the man. Wanted one thing above all, the sea road around Africa to India, and the pepper trade at its end. His captains sailed now with a new kind of cargo, padrões, pillars of Lisbon limestone, carved with the royal arms and a cross to be planted on the headlands of the world like signatures on a deed. Cão's voyages have left one signature more personal than any pillar. Far up the Congo, 100 miles inland, where falls finally stop all boats, there is a rock face at Yellala, carved with the royal arms and a line of names. Here arrived the ships of the illustrious King João II of Portugal, Diogo Cão and his companions. Explorers' graffiti, 5 centuries old, at the dead end of a river they had hoped led toward Prester John. The great gestures of the age were made on headlands for kings, but that stone, scratched at the limit of the possible by tired men a long way from the sea, maybe the age's most honest monument. Diogo Cão carried the first of them. In 1482, he found something no European had imagined. The mouth of the Congo, a river so vast it stained the sea, brown and fresh for miles offshore, planted his pillar on its southern point, and opened dealings with the great African kingdom that ruled its banks. On a second voyage, he pushed the line of pillars far down the coast of modern Angola and Namibia, into desert latitudes again. And there, somewhere beyond his last marker, Diogo Cão passes out of the records, and history quietly loses him. João also built, on the Gold Coast Gomeses captains had found, the Enterprise's anchor and its darkest monument. In 1482, a fleet carried out of Lisbon the pre-cut stones, timbers and tiles of an entire fortress, and raised it in weeks on a rented shore, São Jorge da Mina, St. George of the Mine, the first European building in the tropics, planted to guard the gold trade from Castilian interlopers. The local ruler, Kwamina Ansa, had argued shrewdly against permitting it. Friends who visited, he said, stayed better friends than friends who moved in, and was proven right by 4 centuries. Elmina Castle stands today in Ghana, whitewashed above the surf, having passed from gold house to slave house to national monument, the oldest and longest serving witness to everything this series Oceans carried. And João, being João, did not trust the sea alone to answer his question. In the same year that Dias sailed, the king dispatched 2 Arabic-speaking spies overland, disguised as merchants, into the world the ships were reaching for. One of them, Pero de Covilhã, made his patient way through Cairo and down the Red Sea to Aden, crossed with the monsoon to India itself, and walked the pepper markets of Calicut, noting prices, ports and winds, before working down the African coast as far as Mozambique. His report, sent home in secret, told the king in words what Dias would tell him in charts. The Indian Ocean was open water, and the 2 roads met. No European power had ever prepared a discovery so thoroughly. The age of the lone visionary was already quietly becoming the age of the intelligence service. The finishing of Africa fell to Bartolomeu Dias, who sailed from Lisbon in August 1487 with 2 caravels and a store ship, and orders that amounted to keep going. He had also, before the storm, done a small thing with large consequences. At the southern edge of the known coast, he took aboard local provisions and put ashore, at intervals, African men and women he had carried from Lisbon for the purpose, interpreters and envoys, dressed and instructed to speak well of Portugal and to ask after the road to the Indies and the realm of Prester John. It was intelligence work, cousin to Covilhã's, the crown probing ahead of its ships by every channel it had. History records almost nothing of what became of those solitary ambassadors on their beaches. They deserved their sentence in the story. The ages maps were drawn not only by captains. Beyond the last pillar, the coast turned against him. The winds foul, the current against, day after day of beating south into worsening weather. Somewhere near 30 degrees south, Dias did what the school of the Volta had taught his whole generation. He gave up the land and stood out to sea, southwest into the cold, open Atlantic, looking for a wind that would serve. For nearly 2 weeks, the storm carried his little ships south, out of sight of everything, into grey water, colder than any Portuguese sailor had ever felt. And when at last he found his westerlies and ran back east, expecting Africa's shore to stop him, no shore came. He had passed the bottom of the continent without ever seeing it. Think of what those 2 weeks were for the men aboard. 2 caravels of perhaps 50 tons, smaller than a modern harbour tug, running under bare poles or scraps of sail through the roaring latitudes of the South Atlantic, seas higher than their mastheads, coal spray freezing on a rigging of men recruited under a subtropical sun. No land, no chart, no certainty that this ocean ended anywhere at all. The storeship with all their reserves had been left far behind up the coast. Every morning the same grey circle of water. Every noon when the sun showed at all, the reading said only, further south than any man of your nation has ever been. They had no way to know they were making history. They only knew they were cold and small and a very long way from home. He turned north and made land at a bay where herdsmen watched from the hills and knew by the run of the coast, east now and then bending north, what it meant. The way to India lay open. Dias wanted to sail it then and there. His exhausted crews, at the end of their food and their nerve, did not, and after 3 days of argument and a signed protest to preserve his honour, he yielded. They found the storeship again on the homeward run, 9 months after leaving her. 6 of her 9 caretakers dead, and one of the survivors, the story goes, so overcome at the sight of his countrymen's sails that he died of joy. The sea gives few gentler measures of what these voyages cost than that. A man's heart holding out just long enough to be found. On the way home, he finally saw the great cape itself, the mountain-backed headland he had rounded blind in the storm, and named it, says the story, the Cape of Storms. And the king, when Dias made his report in Lisbon after 16 months at sea, listened and looked further than a sailor's memory of bad weather, and renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. The sea kept its own account with Dias and settled it with terrible poetry. He was never given the India command his voyage had earned. He helped design the ships for it, saw another man sail them, and in 1500 went out at last as a captain in the great follow-up fleet, which was blown on its outward loop to a landfall no one expected. Brazil, with Dias aboard, present at one more accidental continent. Weeks later, in the South Atlantic, 4 ships went down in a single storm with all hands. Bartolomeu Dias drowned within sight of no land at all. On the deep sea road to the Cape, he himself had been the first to turn, the Cape of Storms that a king had renamed, over a sailor's honest objection, Good Hope. Among those present in Lisbon around the time Dias came home, the records suggest was an ambitious Genoese chart maker who had been pestering the Portuguese court for ships to try a different road to the Indies, west straight across the ocean. João's experts had already turned him down. With Africa all but solved, Portugal needed no second road. So the Genoese packed his charts and his arguments and took them to Spain instead. His name, of course, was Christopher Columbus, and he is where we go next. Spare a final thought tonight for the men of the 16th attempt, for Gil Eanes standing on the wrong side of the world's oldest fear, holding a cask of flowers, for the pilots swinging wide into an empty ocean to find the way home, and for the people in the meadow at Lagos, whose names no chronicle kept, and whose descendants would cross every sea this age opened in the holds of its ships. The age of exploration was never one story. It was all of these at once. The courage and the cartography and the chains moving together down a coastline, one cape at a time, until the map of Africa hung complete in the palaces of Lisbon, and the road to everywhere lay open. As for Bartolomeu Dias, the sea kept a long memory of him. 12 years after his great voyage, guiding a fleet bound for India, he was lost in a storm with his ship and all hands, off the Cape of Good Hope, the cape he found and named truly the first time. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.